Good evening, everyone. We're going to get going here in about 2 minutes. Hopefully you're here for understanding the impacts of the 3 business day turnaround for next generation 911. This presentation will dive into what that actually means, where it came from, how does it impact you, and how do we police it? It's going to be difficult, let me tell you. But guys, this is the last presentation for the day, which if you've hung out with us for the day, you've seen a ton of content. Hopefully some of it's captured your ear, captured your eye, has got you thinking, or made you want to reach out to somebody and say, hey, I saw this really cool thing and I want to share it with you. That's really what these things are all about, right? Extending our networks, learning new ideas, learning new things, or reinforcing ideas or thoughts that we already had. But I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me for the last presentation of the day. And for those of us on the East Coast, it's almost dinner time. For me, it usually is dinner time right about now. So I really appreciate you guys hanging out. All right, and it's the top of the hour, so let's get going. Guys, this presentation is entitled Understanding the Impacts of the 3 business day Turnaround for Next Generation 911, or NG9-1-1. Let me click on the right screen so that we can transition slides. Guys, my name is Drew Fiorinelli. I am a GISP. I am also one of the business development managers for Datamark. I bring with me over 15 years of experience working GIS for local government. Also had a brief stint where I supported the Marine Corps at Quantico in helping support their GeoFidelis transition a while back. So I bring a lot of local government knowledge about GIS with me. And that's really kind of where this presentation came from, is this notion, this concept, this idea of next generation 911 is something that we've talked about for, gosh, 10 or 15 years. We saw it slow roll early in the development and early in the process, but we understood that there were a lot of things that still needed to be done. We couldn't just talk about it and throw it out there and expect people to do it. There were standards that needed to be created. There were methodologies, rules, processes, workflows that needed to be created as well as a data model, which I know for me as a local government GIS professional was something that we waited on for quite a while. And if you guys are like me, one of the things that slowly started to trickle out of this next gen conversation was this concept of a 3 business day turnaround. Didn't really know what it meant. It kind of scared me a little bit because I wasn't used to operating against such short deadlines or timelines with correcting my data or remediating my data. So I had to put myself back in my local government shoes when I created this presentation to really articulate and identify what that meant. So where did this concept of a 3 business day turnaround come from? Why is it important? Why is it important to me? Is it only important to me as a data maintainer or a data editor? Which of the NINA data the NINA data management requirement, what is that? How does that impact this 3 business day turnaround concept? And how do we enforce this? Is this something that can be enforced? Is there a NINA police? Is this new? Do I not know about these people? Who do I need to call to introduce myself? And then I really want to look at how this turnaround is going to impact us at the local level, as well as within the vendor community. So that's kind of a rough agenda for what we're going to cover. And I promise you guys, this is the last presentation of the day. I'm going to be honest with you because we're in the truth tree here. I've got 14 slides for you guys. I'm going to take my time. We're going to go through it. I really want to encourage you guys to ask any questions if you have it, or if you can help build on something that I have that's going to engage more people, please throw it in the chat or throw it in the Q&A. And I will remind you before we jump off head first into this, that these are being recorded for replay. I'm also happy to share my slide deck out with you at the end of the presentation. All right, so you've met me, we've covered the agenda, now let's dive into it. The mention of this 3 business day turnaround is in this document. It's in the NINA Next Generation 911 Data Management Requirements document. And if you guys haven't read this, I really want to encourage you to read it. It's a short read. it's got some really interesting information in it. Not only a mention of the 3 business days, but it also has some other requirements that are related to other operations and other functions that we know are going to impact the PSAT, but can also impact the GIS folks. So in the document, it states that turnaround time for the 911 authority to resolve a discrepancy or discrepancy report shall be 3 business days. All of this is a direct copy paste from out of this document. I didn't make any of this stuff up, right? It also states that turnaround time for next gen core services, or NGCS, to produce those discrepancy reports shall be near real time. And that these requirements apply to all of the core services: your emergency call routing function, your location validation function, your location information server, and your spatial interface. So if we take what's written and we bring it into reality and identify what that means, it means our spatial interface or any of our next gen core services will generate a report in near real time. So when we provision our GIS data into our core services environment through our spatial interface, we should see if there's a discrepancy within our data be produced in near real time, right? So immediately. That's great for us as GIS professionals because it means that we're not going to share our data with 911. They're going to put it in CAD, and we're going to have to wait for a call at that location to identify if there's an error or a discrepancy on our data. It's going to be auto-generated through the spatial interface, which I think is fantastic. But that also means, if we go back to the very top, I've got 3 days to correct any anomalies that are identified. Now, as we dig into this deeper, we can see that this document is specifically sectioned out based on the different core services. So it starts with the spatial interface, that's page 15, 3.3, towards the top. It starts leading us down this path, identifying the types of things the spatial interface is going to be looking for out of our GIS data. For instance, invalid geometry. Fantastic. As a GIS person, I really want to know if I have invalid geometry. Any gaps or overlaps, any duplicate attribution as defined by the spatial interface. So what duplication exists in our attribute tables? That's going to be important for me to know. It's going to be looking for mandatory fields and if they're missing or mismatched data types. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the NG9-1-1 data model, right? And it's got the mandatory, optional, and conditional fields. Well, this is telling us that the spatial interface is specifically looking at those mandatory fields, which means you get to have a little leeway with the conditional and the optional fields, and let those be a best fit for your organization or for your data management practices. That's good to know going into this conversation, as you may be at a point where you're starting to identify how you're going to integrate the data model into your existing schema, or how or in what way you're going to migrate to the NG9-1-1 data model. I know there are a lot of folks that have already established a data model for their state that's a derivative of the NINA data model, which is fine as well. But here we know that specifically we need to be aware of those mandatory fields, because that's what's going to be looked at for as part of these anomalies that are being identified in the spatial interface. We're going to look at address range issues on the center line, general provisioning failure to the SI or ECRF and LVF. So did we run into a problem with taking our GIS data and loading it into the core services environment via the SI? Now, here's something that's important to remember when we think about that provisioning process and identifying that failure. It's not a all or none process, right? So if you have an anomaly that exists in your address point data, it's not going to kick all of that data out. It's going to accept what passes and reject what fails, or create a report on what fails. Hopefully that makes a lot of sense. It took me a while to figure that out, but it's also going to do the same with our emergency call routing function and our location validation function. I do have a diagram here in a minute that we're really going to be able to visualize this process and how data gets moved around and how these reports are generated from each of these components. Right, we're also going to be looking for anomalies within the URI or the Uniform Resource Identifier. When I started reading through this document to develop an understanding of what the 3 business day turnaround actually meant, I found this note as it related to the SI that I thought was extremely valuable for me as a GIS professional and was something that I could share with other GIS professionals and public safety professionals that I would come across on this journey to for migration to next generation 911. And it's that it is expected that 911 authorities will perform quality assurance, quality control processes listed above. So like the ones that we have listed at the top here, prior to provisioning data into the core services environment, thus minimizing errors and kind of reducing that resolution time frame for the provisioning process. It wasn't until I read this document that had been explained to me or that I had seen that. And it's this process that we as GIS professionals and 911 professionals are really encouraged and expected to pre-validate our data to identify anomalies prior to provisioning them into the core services environment via the SI. So what does that mean? Well, it means you could operate in a couple of different methodologies. You can take your existing address points, road center lines, and boundary data that you've created to support next generation 911. And if you have a core services provider and you have an ESInet and a spatial interface, you can throw that data into the ESInet and let that generate the discrepancy report for you. Absolutely, you can do that. Where you may run into some problems, though, is if your locality or your region or your state or your county is ready to start executing geospatial call routing, that service, you're ready to flip that switch, you're going to have to wait if you've taken that approach, because you're going to throw your data into the SI. You're going to get this massive anomaly report back out of the spatial interface that now you have to correct. You have to identify things as exceptions, things that you're not going to change. It's an acceptable rule. That's cool. You can do that. Or you have to identify the anomalies that you are going to correct. And then that can become a time-consuming process. I'll tell you, during my time in local government, we went through this process, but we were of the let's pre-validate our data before we provision it to the spatial interface. And it took us 2 years to correct all of the anomalies that we had in our data. But at the end of that 2 years, we were ready to start really moving towards a more a better process for geospatial call routing and ready to flip that switch. I don't think the county actually flipped that switch for another 2 years, but it just shows you that this can be a time-consuming process when we're thinking about data and data management for supporting next generation 911. And then we're compounding some of that with things like this, like a 3 business day turnaround. But know that it's acceptable to pre-validate your data. So if you've started thinking about how you're going to do that, I can point you in a ton of different directions as resources to help you figure that out. Or if you have someone that's a developer in your shop, they can start developing rules like the ones that are listed here. And I'll let you know, there's what, 7 or 8, there's 7 listed here as types of things that are reported out of the SI. You are really going to want to look at probably more than 140 different validations. You're not going to look at this document and see a roadmap for developing code or developing anomalies that you want to run your data against, because this is only a 28-page document. But it starts getting you think about, it gets you on that path of thinking about the things that the SI is looking for to identify as an anomaly. So I think that's a really good point to make there. Now, as we move forward, I told you that I would have this diagram for you to identify where the discrepancy reports actually come from. So we see our 911 authority, that's our GIS data provisioning authority, and we see our spatial interface around the center of the page. So your data gets provisioned into the SI, and that GIS data is then redistributed through your location validation function, your list or your location information server, as well as your emergency call routing function and your emergency service routing proxy. So that one provisioning data process or function redistributes that data in these different functions. Now, each function has its own set of validation rules that it's going to run, right? Like location validation function. If that can't pre-validate a location using your data, it's going to spit out an anomaly. If your data doesn't provision into the spatial interface correctly, it's going to spit out an anomaly, or it's going to generate an anomaly. The same with the emergency call routing function. If you can't predetermine where to send the call based on the data that you've provisioned, it's going to flag it as an anomaly. And what it does is it takes all of those anomalies that it's identifying and generates a report that is then provided back to the 911 authority through the SI. So that's where this really comes into play, and it's really important to know these different pieces and know that each piece has its own set of validation rules. Now, whoever your core services provider is will have the ability to generate these rules. You may want to work with them and identify in more depth what they are, what that's going to look like in a report. How are you going to be able to execute against that report? Because the document tells us we have 3 business days to make any corrections that are identified via the spatial interface. Well, day 1 starts when that report's created. Day 1 doesn't start when you read the report, because that report could sit in your email box for 2 or 3 days or a week or whatever. That report could be generated while you're on vacation. That report could be generated during the middle of a really big emergency. That's something that's like a natural disaster, or a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake or a 3-alarm fire. There's a ton of different scenarios that we could work through and identify how to deal with that. But knowing the steps and knowing the process and knowing how things are created, I think is really going to set us up better for success in knowing how to address these issues, right? And then the document continues to go through these different core services, right? We just looked at the SI. Well, now let's look at the emergency call routing function and the location validation function and identify some of the issues that will be reported back to the 911 authority, again, back through the SI. It's going to be incorrect XML schema. It's going to look for unexpected GIS and unexpected layer or unexpected GIS layer attributes, invalid or missing geometry from a feature, or an unauthorized provisioning source. So things that are really important to the accuracy and the functionality of the data. Right now, I'm thinking about something completely different and different aspects of my data, whereas the anomalies identified with the SI were really easy for me as a GIS professional to think about and think how those may manifest and start thinking about how I may remediate those issues or mark them as an exception. Here, I have to think on a different perspective about the data, right? An unauthorized provisioning source. How does that happen? Invalid or missing geometry for a feature, that's fairly easy. I can pre-validate that in my desktop. That's pretty easy for me to find out. An unexpected layer or an attribute. Do I need to update my transition? So what am I writing my current data set into that's getting provisioned? Do I have an attribute that wasn't matched correctly? Do I have a layer that's not necessary for this process that it's identifying? So it gets you thinking just deeper about the data itself. And then the data provision to the ECRF and LVF from the SI. The GIS data is provisioned to ECRF and LVF through the SI. We discussed that. And then we talked about the ability to QA and QC that ahead of time. But let's really focus on that 3 business day, because the turnaround time for the 911 authority to resolve GIS data quality error reports shall be 3 business days. Now, if you guys were like me, when this conversation or this notion started first coming into conversation, you heard a couple of different thoughts. One was it's three days is 3 days is what I first started hearing. Is that 72 hours? So I don't work on weekends. I may have some GIS folks out there that do, but I didn't. So if that report's created on Saturday, or heaven forbid, it's created on Friday at 6:00 p.m. when I've left the office because that's how my scheduling works, am I losing 2 days because I'm not in the office? So now I only have 1 day to resolve the error and get it back into the SI. No, I do want to, it's 3 business days is what's in the document. So if an error report is generated on Friday, theoretically, you have till Tuesday to correct it, right? So Friday, don't worry about Saturday and Sunday unless you want, and then Monday, Tuesday, that's 3 days, 3 business days. So hopefully that puts your mind at ease a little bit, but it's still a very short timeline to correct any anomaly that's identified in your GIS data. And then depending on the type of anomaly that it is, it could take longer than 3 days. Let's be honest. Excuse me one second. So as I read through the document, I started pulling out some of these other pieces that may or may not directly impact me as a GIS professional, but I found really enlightening and reassuring because as a GIS professional, I wasn't the only one that was being held to a very short timeline to correct a discrepancy report. For instance, through the emergency services routing proxy, for the ESRP operator to produce a discrepancy report, again, that's going to happen near real time because that's an automated process within the core services environment. But from the time of the creation of that discrepancy report, the 911 authority or whoever that person delegates the responsibility to has 1 business day to make the correction. Same for misrouted calls. So when the PSAP produces a report for a misrouted call, you've got 1 day to fix that. So 1 day to identify why the call was misrouted and produce a correction for that. Also for the PSAP, issues found in the map. So your CAD map. Now this is a completely new one for me. It kind of blew my mind a little bit because this is something I haven't thought about, although I've been part of this data correction process. But at the PSAP, when an error report is generated because a call taker, dispatcher, someone found an error in the map, you have 1 business day to make that correction. So it's really important to understand here, while it's really broad, it covers a lot of things because this discrepancy report most times is not an automated process, right? Some CAD systems I know will have the ability to generate reports for misrouted calls, for sure. What if the error isn't corrected in 3 days? We're going to get to that. Just hang on. I got to save the best piece for last, so we didn't get a question. So yeah, not all of the discrepancy reports that are generated are going to be automated through the SI. For instance, identifying an issue that's found in your CAD map really takes someone who's visually connected to the map or using the map for some reason, right? Let's say it's a fire hydrant. Something happened to your fire hydrant layer, or you know that some new fire hydrants came in and they're not displayed on the map, and you make a sticky note and you send that sticky note to your shift supervisor or the 911 authority. That sticky note is that discrepancy report. The email that you generate to send off to GIS, that's the discrepancy report. So don't think about this report in this instance being something that's automated by machine. This can be generated by person, distributed in a multitude of ways. It's still a discrepancy report at the end of the day, meaning that clock starts ticking. So if we work through this process and identify the call taker or the dispatcher identifies an error in the data in the map, generates a sticky note, fires off an email, whatever report may be generated, GIS has 1 day to resolve that discrepancy and turn it around. But here's where it gets interesting in the documentation is above it says 1 day, but in the description below it states the turnaround time for GIS to resolve the discrepancy shall be as soon as practical, depending on criticality as defined by the PSAP or 911 authority. So that's an inconsistency in the documentation. But I think really what it's speaking to, it's acknowledging that some things may not be just a 3-alarm fire to fix. You may not have to act as fast on map issues, right? Like updating a fire hydrant layer. Maybe you can do that on a Monday or a Tuesday if it's identified on a Friday. So we're extending it out to that 3 days and not that one business day. But it's up to the 911 authority to identify how important that piece of information is to a dispatcher or a call taker, like a missing subdivision, or someone accidentally deleted a road centerline layer or an address point layer, or you're missing some wayfinder viewpoints or points of interest. A points of interest layer I know is extremely important for 911 call takers and dispatchers. So that may be a critical piece of information that's required in the map that you need to execute really quickly to resolve. So there's a lot of leeway there, but understand the 911 authority is going to dictate how important it is. Thought that was a really fun piece of information. Sorry if you can hear the dog barking in the background, guys. The joys of working virtually from home. All right. So here's where we get to your question. Part one of your question. So I got a question, what if the error isn't corrected in 3 days? Well, that brought up this really amazing question for me is, okay, I understand that there's value in executing really quickly on resolving anomalies within the data because of what we're supporting. We're supporting the public, we're supporting public safety, and we're supporting getting people help really fast. Got it. Extremely important stuff, but how do you police that? It is nearly impossible to police that, right? Those discrepancy reports aren't submitted back to a governing body at NENA who starts a time clock when it's created in near real time and calls you in 3 days and say, hey, are you done? Right? There's no resolution report that's generated and sent somewhere to say, hey, this discrepancy was fixed. But acknowledging that it's nearly impossible to enforce does not dismiss the real world implications. And this is where not really understanding or having the resources or the capability to execute this quickly against some of these discrepancies could really impact you locally. And being able to identify those potential impacts early in the process is going to benefit you in the long run. So locally, do you have the resources to execute this quickly? If you're the only GIS person in your community, it's going to be hard for you, depending on what else is on your plate, because you're already wearing so many hats. And then throw a learning curve on top of that. Do you have the ability, the knowledge or the ability or the resources to drop whatever you're doing to fix that really quickly? It's gonna vary depending on the type of anomaly. Sure, you need to update an address point, you need to fix an attribute, you need to eliminate a gap or an overlap in a boundary that's internal to your county. Quick. I can do that stuff in 30 seconds, right? Really quick. But what if it's a boundary issue with my neighbor? There's a gap or overlap or there's a data discrepancy where I can't make that decision or fix that in a silo. I have to have somebody else look at it with me and we have to make a decision together. Now I have to call the data maintainer, the data editor for my neighbor, get together, look at the discrepancy report and figure it out. Hopefully during this process, you've formulated relationships that allow you to do that quickly, but You may not like the person. They may not like you. They may be on vacation. You may be on vacation. So there's a lot of things that are going to impact the 3 business day turnaround. That's why we have to acknowledge that it's impossible to enforce this. But there are real world implications. If you have the capability, you have the awareness, but you're just going to let it sit on your desk for a week. Well, what happens if that same call comes in another week and it's a worse outcome? What liabilities exist there? You'll be covered under some law, you'll be covered for sure, but it doesn't dismiss that implication that liability could exist and liability could fall somewhere on the spectrum. I don't know that that's really happened. I don't know that it really could happen, but that's what I have to think about. You know, when I was a GIS director, I would tell my staff all of the time, I didn't care what decisions they made with any mapping products, as long as the decisions that they made, they would go to court and testify for. Because at some point, we kind of have to think about our data that way, that we may be called to court to support a product that we produce, that decisions were made off of. That's liability. And that's real world implication off a printed map. How does that look when our data is now affecting emergency response? And we sat on it for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, because we were unaware of the 3 business day turnaround or the implications or even a process to execute that well. Well, this also affects the vendor community. If you are a locality that does not manage your own GIS, you pay a third party to do that, make sure they're aware of this as well. Bring them into the conversation. Do they have the capabilities? Are they part of the workflow that is going to be notified when a discrepancy is identified or created? Right. This is also where pre-validating your data before you provision to the ESInet is going to impact you immensely. Identifying and understanding what you don't know about your data ahead of time is really going to shrink that liability, shrink those real world implications, because you're perfecting, you're massaging, you're managing your data before it has the ability to have this significant impact at a large scale. That's not going to dismiss it from happening, because we're human at the end of the day, and we can all accidentally hit caps lock or fat finger something, just getting in a zone of doing some data edits. It happens. But having the ability to pre-validate your data and a process that allows you to do that is going to ensure that some of that stuff doesn't make it into the SI, or even worse, makes it through the SI so that it does have implications on call routing. Right, so let's look at this a different way, really understanding those impacts on our community, on our workforce, right? We just went through the, if you don't have GIS and you're supported by the vendor community, that could be a significant impact. Bringing them to the conversation early, understanding what learning curves may exist, or developing new workflows. Well, what if you are operating GIS, or your primary responsibility is not as a call taker, but you're a dispatcher or a call taker part-time? So that's a secondary role for you. Do you have the resources and the capabilities to execute these turnarounds that fast? Even if you're the primary person that's responsible for managing the data, or your role is as a call taker or a dispatcher, do you have the knowledge and the ability, or even the desire, to understand what all of this going on means? There could be implications there, so you have to train up and you have to have knowledge. If you're an enterprise GIS shop, or you're a bigger PSAP, make sure your people understand what these implications are as well. Let's focus on the GIS side for a minute. As an enterprise shop, you may have multiple staff members that are working on different pieces of data. Does the 911 authority know who to distribute that discrepancy report to? It could come to you as the GIS manager, and then you're able to distribute that to the right person. Or do you cut you out of the process, or put you on that email chain that goes to me as the address point maintainer, or my colleague who's managing road center lines, or Brenda that's over in the other desk because she manages boundaries? I don't know. But think about these workflows and think about these processes and figure out how you can shorten the time it takes to get the report to the person that it needs to go to that can execute the fix fastest, right? It could be somebody that's in your shop. It could be somebody that's in another building, another location, or even another state if you're using a vendor. So that's where it gets really important. And then I developed this timeline to start giving you something to think about. How do we take what's written and put it into something that's a little more visual, right? So day one is when the discrepancy report is created. That's either an automated process out of the core services environment via your spatial interface, or it's that sticky note or an email. That's day one. Whenever it's created, that's when the clock starts. It's not when you read it, it's when the report's created. And then you have the remediation process that happens from the time the report's created to it gets to somebody that can look at it and fix it. And then day three, by the end of day three, it's got to be back into the SI. So re-provisioned back into the SI, right? Pretty easy depending on the type of anomaly. I'll also state that depending on the type of anomaly, I think as long as you've identified the anomaly, you've started working towards executing a fix for it quickly, you're covered on the liability side. Because some of this stuff is going to take longer than 3 days, right? Again, it's nearly impossible to meet that timeline depending on the type of anomaly that it is. So just know that being aware of it and having a process in place that is working towards a correction is better than nothing. And because you're sitting in here, you can't be naive about it and say that you didn't know, right? Which is the other reason I put this together, because it actually helped me explain to people what this 3 business day means, right? But as you dig into it, remember, it's not just an automated report out of your core services environment. Could be a sticky note, could be an email, could be a paper napkin. It could be a conversation that you had in passing in the hallway with your shift supervisor or your PSAP director or your GIS person. You pick up the phone, you call them, say, hey, 1382 North Main Street didn't route correctly. Can you check it out, see what's going on? That's a report. It doesn't have to be written. It can be vocal. Any acknowledgement that there was an error identified in the map or in the data in itself is a discrepancy report. It gets a little tricky, right? All right, relationships. Relationships are going to be a big part of this. In the example we used earlier with a boundary issue, having good relationships with your neighbors is really going to help you expedite some of these corrections, because hopefully you've worked together to identify that anomaly reports out of the spatial interface are going to take a priority in some capacity. So you can expect a phone call that says, hey, report was generated. Let's look at it. Let's start the process. Build those relationships early. Build them while you're developing your boundary data for next gen. Build them while you're identifying anomalies. Run cross-jurisdictional data validations to see how your data matches with theirs at the borders and at your boundaries. Solidify, reinforce, right? Support each other in this process, because it's going to be important, specifically as it relates to addressing data anomalies and expediting and fixing those very quickly. If you have poor relationships, you have no relationships, it could lengthen that process to beyond the really short time frame that it already is. And we really don't want to see that. So it's going to be important early in the process to formulate these internal relationships between GIS, public safety, planning, whoever else is managing the GIS data and who's in the workflow, as well as with your external neighbors, counties that touch you. Do you know who their GIS folks are? Do you know who their 911 administrators are? Do you know who their core services provider is? That could be important. Maybe they're using the same guy as you are. That helps. Maybe they're not, right? So dig into each other a little bit and identify this information. If you need to create MOUs for it, do that. Whatever you need to do to feel comfortable with it and support whatever decisions you're going to make, start that process early. It's only going to help you in the long run. Oh, right? And then I really wanted to kind of articulate some plan or some path that you guys could think about as you move forward. Because remember, as we stated earlier, it's expected that we will pre-validate or perform QA, QC, quality assurance, quality control processes prior to provisioning our data into the SI or our core services environment. Because our objective is to minimize the number of errors that are being provisioned and develop faster timeframes for resolving these anomalies, right? We're identifying what we don't know early in the process by doing pre-validations. Super important. So resolving discrepancies must become a priority internally and externally between you and your staff and your neighbors, because at some point you're going to have to work together on this. Pre-validation and remediating GIS data prior to provisioning the SI. Know what you don't know ahead of time. I can't say that enough. That's why you hear me repeat it a lot, because it's extremely important and it's extremely valuable. As you start thinking about putting a plan together to support this transition, think about developing a strategic plan, or in your strategic plan, does it address how you're going to resolve anomalies or discrepancy reports identified from your core services environment? It may not. And if it doesn't, write that in with your neighbors so that you're both on the same page. Run data comparisons and evaluations ahead of time. Fill out, develop a complete geospatial data set. Do you have multiple data sets that you can compare against each other to find address points that may be missing in your master data set? That's a great conversation to have. And if you want to learn more about that, please let me know. When you start thinking about the discrepancies that are identified in that pre-validation process and the discrepancies that are identified through your core services environment, your remediation process is going to be important as well. What data points do you tackle first? You want to start with your road center lines, because that's where we derive all of our address points from. So you don't want to get those reports and immediately go to address points thinking that's what you need to fix first. You could resolve a ton of those issues by starting with the anomalies that were found within your road center line data. So resolve those first and then rerun your validations, because now hopefully you have the ability to pre-validate your data. Run validations against your boundaries. Those you can fix at the same time as your road center lines, because they don't impact your road center lines or your address points as much. They do at the borders, but in the meat of your county or the meat of your locality, they don't. So you can run validation against your road center lines and your boundaries at the same time and develop a process for remediation there. Include your neighbors in the boundaries, though, because remember, you can't have gaps or overlaps between your boundaries and your neighbor's boundaries. So those need to be coincident and consistent as well. That could take a lot of time, but you could be working on that while you're working on your road center line data as well. Once you get all that stuff real smoothed out and it looks good, the anomalies have decreased, you've rerun your validations a couple of times, normalize that data with your MSAG, your alley, and your address points, and then focus on those anomalies and then correct those as well. And this is a cyclical process. This never stops, because at the end of this plan is data maintenance. And data maintenance is something that, in my opinion, we don't talk about enough, right? We do all of this work, get this data where it needs to be to meet this geospatial call routing. It's working at a high level, but then we forget this maintenance process that's important. And in your maintenance process, include the ability to run data validations. If you go into your data and you update a road name, you draw on a new subdivision, you flipped address points, or you marked an exception for an address point that you weren't going to change until the house was up for sale. Well, now the house is up for sale, so you can go in and make it correct because you remember those notes that you took. The ability to rerun your validations is going to be extremely important while you're doing your data management. We got a question come in, so I'm going to address it. Would you suggest reaching out to neighboring cities, counties, states to match boundaries or centerline comparison? Yes, I do. I would encourage you to start reaching out to your neighbors. How far you go is really going to depend on the geographical location of your locality. If you're a county that sits right there in one of those state corners and you've got to reach across the state line, do that. My county where I was at here in Northern Virginia, we touched 8 different counties. So I needed to make contact with all 8 counties, or 9 counties actually, so that we could share boundary data with and run comparisons and validations against. And it's a slow process because you can't attack it all at once. You have to take that 15-mile stretch of boundary that you share with X county and the 2-mile stretch that you share with Y county and correct those individually. So if you're a county that is bordered by a lot of other counties or other states in some scenarios, it's going to be a process. That's why I encourage you to start those conversations early and make sure that you have a validation solution that will let you do cross-jurisdictional validations, that will let you pull in your neighbor's data to identify where there are discrepancies in your road center lines, where they don't match because you're at a boundary, or a gap and overlap between your provisioning boundary or your PSAP boundary or one of your emergency service boundaries, because all that stuff needs to be coincident, not only internal for you as a county service provider and your cities or townships that exist in your county, because those have to be coincident boundaries as well. It's got to be the same with your neighbors, your other counties, your other states. So yes, start that conversation early. If you need help in getting those conversations started, please reach out to me. I can walk you through a process that will help you start those questions or start those conversations. I'm happy to do that. And remember that, so I'm going to go back to data maintenance for a second, because as you maintain data at the boundaries, it's going to be important to continue those relationships with your neighbors. As new roads are built cross boundaries, new roads are eliminated and removed for whatever reason, new bridges, new subdivisions. I know there are some instances where folks have subdivisions or address points that are outside of your county, but you're the first due response there. Those are unique and are really important for having solid relationships with your neighbors to understand, one, how that call is going to be routed. So which PSAP boundary does that point go in, right? What provisioning boundary that point goes in. So who's responsible for maintaining the data? And then what emergency service boundary is going to encompass that address point or that location based on MOUs that you've established. So it's your neighbor's point, but you're dispatching fire. Does that call need to come to you, or does the call go to your neighbor and then they transmit it to you, right? It gets a little tricky, but it's off topic a little bit as well. But that's where relationships are going to be extremely important. All right, guys. So that's what I've got for you today. We've gotten a couple of really good questions. I hope this really helped redefine or define what the 3 business day turnaround means and how you should actually think about it. Can you police it? No, it's impossible. But should you be aware of it? Yes. Oh, well, oops, wrong button. You need to be aware of it so that you can start making plans to take action against these anomaly reports when they come in. And remember, anomaly reports are not automated reports, or are not only automated reports. They can be phone calls, they can be emails, they can be sticky notes, they can be notes written on napkins. That can be an anomaly report or a discrepancy report. So keep that in mind as you move forward. Guys, we have a few minutes. If you've got any more questions, please throw them in the chat or throw them in the Q&A. I'll gladly answer them. Also, feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. This is a topic that I love to talk about. I also really love to talk about GIS as it relates to public safety. So feel free to reach out. I really appreciate you guys hanging out with me. We'll wait about 30 seconds to see if any questions come in. And if they don't, I give you 2 minutes of the presentation back. And I hope you guys have had a really good couple of days at our event. We're really excited to bring this to you. We're really thankful for all the presenters that we have. I'd love to get some feedback from you. What have you liked? What have you not liked? What's really resonated well with you? What was a really good topic? Do you like the platform? Do you like the speakers? Do you not like the speakers? Any feedback that you guys have about the virtual conference that'll help us improve it for next year, I would love to hear your feedback, good and bad. All right, and with no questions coming in, guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me this evening. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. We'll see you first thing in the morning. Y'all have a great day.